This is every size miter saw available on the US market. Which one's best for you? Hopefully we can figure that out. We're going to cover some key features, blade selection, and a few things that might surprise you. Jumping right into it, we have some blades here. When you're buying a miter saw blade, you want to keep an eye on the hook. -5 hook, that's fairly common. Sometimes they get to -7 or so, but what that means is that if you were going to come 90 degrees off of your arbor hole, that blade's actually tilted backwards. The purpose of that is so that when you're cutting down, it's pushing the material towards your miter saw table. Now for reference, this is a table saw blade with a 20-degree positive hook. That is to pull the material down towards your table saw table. We have some task-specific blades that are available in all sizes for these miter saws. We have steel, aluminum, Trex, cementitious, and then just some 7 1/4 thin kerfs that could potentially be the reason that maybe you don't love your 7 1/4 saw, because when you go to do a flat bevel, it's got a little flex there. Just pursue a better blade from a better brand and you should be able to mitigate that blade deflection. Getting into the 7 1/4 saw, I think this would absolutely shock you what this saw is genuinely capable of. This is one of the main points of this video, is to prove that bigger isn't always better. We have all sorts of small moldings here. We have common household moldings. Maybe you live in a colonial. We're in the eastern region of the United States. We see a lot of colonials. So 3.5 colonial baseboard, 2.5 colonial casing. This saw is capable of both of those things. Maybe you have 1x4 casing, butt joints like that. SAR is also capable of that. We also have, this actually will do 1x5. So if you have vents like this and you want things to look seamless, you can use 1x5 with a nice base cap straight across it. You throw a plinth block in the mix, maybe some belly casing, get yourself a 1x5 header with a trim piece, a Craftsman header, across it like that, as well as maybe a 2.5 crown molding or a bed molding. This saw can do all that. You could make your house look like a master craftsman trimmed it with this little teeny tiny saw. Now, this here is actually a 2-piece, but more recently and more commonly, speed base has replaced that. But to cut 5 1/4 speed base, we need to get ourselves up to a 10-inch saw. Now, the 10-inch saw is great because we see a lot of 3.5-inch casing that needs to be mitered. These synergize well because we have about a 9/16 base and a strong 5/8 11/16 casing. That looks nice. And once you get up to the 10-inch saw, you can also do 4x4s, and you can get a bigger nested crown, as well as you can butt cut decking 1x6 and 2x6. And then all your common tongue and grooves, PVC or wood, 5.5, whatever it is. I also just have a little jig here from kitchen crown that I did about a month ago. Worked perfectly. We'll jump right over to the 12-inch saw. Now, you're going to notice a theme here. The 7 1/4 goes 1x4, 1x5, and the 10-inch goes up to the 1x6, and miters 1x4, and now the 12-inch goes up to 1x8, 2x8, and miters 5.5. So that's going to get your decking, picture frames, things like that. It will also do, maybe your deck is got 2x8 framing. It will also do your skirts around your deck, and it will also, you know, I see some guys talking about cutting baseboard vertically, and the reason for that is you put it upside down, you cut it backward, you cut it your miter that way, you go back to like a 15, give that thing a deuce, and that's all you got left to cope. I don't ever do that because more often than not, your corner beads are actually not perfect. So generally you're scribing your corner bead, laying it flat on its back, adjusting to whatever that scribe may be, and then mitering from this way down. So I don't think that that's necessarily a feature you need to be considering when you're looking at a bigger saw like this. This saw will also do common deck railings as well as common post sleeves. So maybe a 4-inch, 4 1/4 post sleeve. You're not quite getting into that arbor yet. So it's a fairly versatile saw, but one downfall will always be when you don't have a sliding saw, you can see where your cut hits. So I'll just do this so you can see a little easier. you can see where the teeth actually contact the material, and that's not ideal. So that's when you start to get into the benefits of a sliding miter saw. So when you're sliding, you can feed down and kind of creep up on your cut and work your way down, and then do that final one pass to clean it up. This is a little bit more crude in your approach. So that can be a downfall of the fixed miter saws, but it's still a very versatile saw. Might be the only one that you need for your house. Now, that brings us on to the next feature, just because we're standing next to the saw, dual bevel. How necessary is dual bevel? Well, to put things in perspective, I've been doing this about 14, 15 years now, and all of my common carries, the old Hitachi, the cordless DeWalt, the cordless Bosch, the cordless Metabo, they're all single bevel. And I've never once felt like that hindered me in any way. I know some guys absolutely are going to want the dual bevel, and I completely understand that. If you're a full-time trim guy, it just makes sense. But for me, it's never been a problem. As a remodeler, sometimes I go, 2, 3 weeks a month between even doing trim jobs, whereas some guys, that's all they do every day. So it's just going to make sense to have that ease of use of the dual bevel. Now, jumping over here, this is one of the downfalls that I found of the sliding 7 1/4. They're obviously great little saws, but they come up short on 1x10. It has an 8.5-inch crosscut capacity, and that just doesn't make sense to me. Obviously, as some of you guys know, you can get out here, lift the material at the end of the cut, and it will do a 1x10, but that doesn't work on bevels. So that's kind of, that's just, to me, that doesn't make sense. Why would you make it 8.5? So close to 9 1/4. Just get it to that, give it that extra inch. We could all use an inch, right? And then, so even the Cobalt actually will do the 1x10. So I actually mentioned it earlier, I don't mean to bounce around, but you can see the blade flex on this 7 1/4 like so. And when you're on a flat bevel, that blade actually wants to chatter. Like if you're doing, maybe if I was doing a hardwood here or something like that, that blade's going to want to chatter. For a long time, I actually used the Diablo Steel Demon in my 7 1/4 here, just because it's got the thick kerf. So I was able to get rid of that chatter. It's not the best blade for cutting wood because it has an odd tooth configuration, so it makes for slow cuts, but it did what I needed it to do for a very long time, and it never dulled up because it was made to cut steel. So jumping into the 8.5, and this kind of goes beyond the 8.5 saw and into a very versatile outfeed system. So I just have a piece of plywood here with some blocks. It's oversized from my miter saw and sandwiched between my saw and my brackets, and it has a little block here that just allows me to screw any 2x material as my outfeed. So if I just got a couple of 8-foot 2x4s on site and I'm getting into the trim work, those can be my outfeeds. If I'm doing 20-foot PVC decking or 18-foot PVC exterior trim, I can throw 16-foot 2x12s on this thing and get a real cozy setup. Now it's very versatile to have 2x wood outfeeds, because if I want to do a stop block for repeated cuts, I'll just get where I want to be and screw that thing down. If I want to do a system like this for hyperextended angles, such as a 60-degree angle, real quick to go into that. So if we have two pieces here at 45, then if we want a 60-degree cut, then we're just going to adjust our miter saw to 15 degrees, and then we're going to make our cut, and that's all you got to do. So these pieces, you just would screw like a 4-foot piece of 1x4 or a 2x4 or something like that down to your outfeeds, because they're disposable outfeeds. They're not like egregiously priced like some of the ones that we see in the multiple thousands of dollars. It's just absolutely ridiculous. They're disposable, so you can screw right into them, take these off as needed, and you have what you need. I actually have these set up here. I wanted to mention that the rollers that you get are horrible. I hate those. They will redirect your material if they're not perfectly perpendicular or parallel with your saw. So these material supports are far superior. That's just kind of a side note. But getting into the next feature that you might want to look for in a saw is going to be your depth stop. If you see that there, that's going to stop my blade before it gets to the ground. Now, What this does is it opens the door to make rabbets and dados. This is a rabbet because it's on the outside of the material, and this is a dado because it's somewhere in the field of the material. And you can make lap joints. So depending on what you need out of a saw, you do want to keep an eye out for a depth stop. Now, is this a common thing? Not really, because only 3 or 4 of these saws have it. The DeWalt doesn't have it, the Metabo, the Ryobi, that big Bosch that is fairly expensive and somewhat new, the DeWalt doesn't have it. So just these 2 DeWalts, the Hitachi, and actually the Cobalt does have it, the $80 Cobalt does have it, and this Bosch have the depth stop. So if you have plans on doing some lap joints, then you're going to want to keep an eye on that depth stop. Now, just so we can cover as much with one saw as possible, back rails. As you can see, we need a lot of space back here. A lot of saws now will have front rails so that you're able to put your saw basically tight to the wall. And obviously that can be a big determiner for somebody with limited space as to what saw they would like to buy. There's other features such as a lever lock here in the front, and that's going to control your bevel so you don't have to reach back here. So if you're looking for the best of the best saws, you're going to look for front rails, front bevel lock, and even as far as rack and pinion systems for your bevels, which is going to be the finest tune that you can get if you're trying to be as accurate as possible, which we always are. But, you know, some people don't have $1,000, $1,500 to spend on a saw. Now, jumping over here, obviously this exact miter saw outfeed system can be put into any miter saw. So that's why I kind of have this thing sitting here as a very hyperextended angle, because if you're doing, say, a lot of barn style tables, you know, and you need to do some lap joints and stuff, and those are going to be your cross braces for that table, you're going to need the beefy saw. This saw here is the commonly known 779, and this thing will cut right through this 4x6 and 2 4x4s at the same time. If you're looking for a one-stop shop for a saw, then this is the one. You know, if this thing's going to set up camp in your shop and you don't have any restrictions in the back, you're going to get the 779 or the 780. You know, because it's got that 13.5-inch, 14-inch cut capacity. I believe it's sold as being able to cut 2x14 or 4x14, which is obviously impressive. And then I just have this saw out here for 2 reasons. One, it's to show you that not all 12-inch saws are created equal. This is the old school 709, and it is a 12-inch miter saw, but it only has a 10.5-inch capacity. That's obviously silly. Everything in this size range should be more than capable of cutting a 2x12 or a 1x12. That is a restricting feature. So that brings us on to the knob versus lever situation here. Now, in my experience, a lot of these knobs here, when you go into or trying to micro adjust around a fixed detent, as you screw it in, that just wants to fall right back into a detent. That's not good when you're trying to do fractions of a degree, and you really need that ability to micro adjust. So DeWalt is superior in that I can actually unlock the detent feature so that I can move it freely, and then I can micro adjust accordingly to a fraction of a degree, lock this thing down, and we're all set. That's just a better system. Now, that brings us on to another thing. Micro adjustability in terms of tuning your saw. DeWalt has a great system where you just loosen the screws on this steel plate here, and you're able to fine tune that to 0 and 45 and just get it perfect. A lot of these saws don't have it. This 35-year-old Hitachi does not have it, which is why it's all but retired at this point, because it's good on 45s, but it's not good on 0, and I have no way to fix that. The Bosch, if this thing wasn't perfect, then I wouldn't be able to use it because it has no micro adjustability. This DeWalt is good. The Cobalt has no micro adjustability. This Metabo doesn't. These two, the Bosch and the DeWalt do. So that's something you do want to look for when you're thinking about purchasing a saw. Is it the end-all be-all? No, otherwise I wouldn't own this Metabo or that Bosch, which are my primary everyday carries. But it's definitely something that you want to consider right out of the box, which is why this is actually my second Metabo, because the first one was inaccurate with no way of adjusting it. And that just, to me, it seems like a no-brainer that every single saw should have a very pragmatic adjustability system. That just would make the most sense to me. But to recap, when you're looking for a saw, do you absolutely need dual bevel? I don't know. It's up to you. That's whatever you determine. You know, do you need front rails, or is the back rails fine? You're probably going to save some money there. Do you need to be able to cut up to a 4x14? You know, if you're doing some barn door styles, barn style tables, maybe you do. You know, don't waste all that money on those ridiculous outfeed systems when you can use a few 2x and screw right down into them. You know, can you trim your whole house with a 7 1/4? I'm gonna guess that most of you probably could. It's a great little hobby saw. Back to the, sorry, I'm bouncing around here, but back to the blades. In my personal opinion, you're gonna, to really eliminate tear out, you're gonna need to get into that 80 or 100 tooth count range. And for an 8.5 inch saw, if maybe that's what you were thinking about, that's difficult to track down. It's much easier to find a higher tooth count blade for a 10-inch saw than maybe a 7 1/4 and 8.5. So maybe that determines what you might be aiming for. And you know, there's so much out there. I'm hoping that this can clear a little bit up for you. I know I'm bouncing around a little bit, but each saw seems to have a gradual increase in capability based on size, obviously. But do you need the biggest one-stop shop saw for the task that you might be thinking about tackling? Probably not. You know, is it going to do absolutely everything that you need it to do? Yes, it will. But is it overkill? It could be. I mean, I can lift this saw with my pinky. I can carry this up 3 flights of stairs without even thinking about it. If I was trying to do that with the DeWalt, I'd need a break, you know? I'd be heavy breathing by the time I got up there. So let's just give a shout out, little celebrity guest appearance to the old Frankenstein saw. If you've been following me for a while, this was the first miter saw I ever had. This was given to me for Christmas, I believe my junior year of high school, and it was just, you know, I cut it open and made it a miter saw, table saw, and it was perfect for the time that I had it, and it's just a great little novelty at this point, you know. So that's pretty much it. I really hope this helps. Give the video a like if you want. If not, that's all right. And leave any questions or comments below. And, you know, hopefully you can confidently buy a miter saw now.